Hey, my name is Jeffrey Wang. I am a sophomore in Lowell House, and I study CS Math and English. My capstone presentation for sleep studies the adverse health factors that affect long-haul commercial drivers. So first, let's talk a bit about who these drivers are. There are 3.5 million truck drivers in the United States, and they are overwhelmingly men. They tend to be older and have less formal education than the general populace. Obviously, commercial driving isn't just in the US. There are over 10 million commercial drivers internationally. And as we'll see, the problem that we're analyzing in this presentation really is one of really broad scope. So what is the problem? The problem, put simply, is that commercial drivers don't get enough sleep. A study in the New England Journal of Medicine from 1998 found that long haulers average 5 to 6 hours of sleep each night. And a variety of other studies have found that this is connected with sleep apnea, daytime sleepiness, and other factors that I'll analyze in a slide or two. You can see right here from the same New England Journal of Medicine study, this is an electroencephalogram segment, basically the brain waves at 2:24 a.m. of a driver. This is 20 seconds right here. And you can literally see as the driver is driving that he is having these slow rolling eye movements, which means that he is falling asleep. This is quite scary. Although sleep deprivation is the core health issue, it's connected to tons of other things. For instance, a significant percentage of drivers suffer from sleep apnea of some kind. They also tend to have higher BMI, weight problems, cardiovascular problems, metabolic problems. And you can see these two studies right here, the amount of years someone has spent driving and their average sleep quality in a study of long haulers in North Carolina are statistically significant predictors of cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, smoking, and obesity. Another study of 1670 drivers from 48 states found that at least 61% of them reported at least two of a bevy of negative health factors that are associated with sleep deprivation. Let's narrow down a little bit more specifically on obstructive sleep apnea, because this is a condition that often is a causal factor of a lack of sleep. A study of Australian drivers found that 44% of them suffered from it, but only 4.4% of them had been diagnosed. Now, this is a really big issue because severe obstructive sleep apnea is highly correlated with mortality. It's a really large health consequence. And as we see here, diagnosis of this condition actually seems to be a huge roadblock to treatment and prevention. Obviously, there are societal risks here too. We share highways and roads with commercial truck drivers that have these huge, heavy tonnage vehicles. And, crashing is often fatal for people that get hit by these trucks. In 2006, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration looked at all 50,000 or so truck crashes that happened in the US that year. And they analyzed every single one of them. They found that the top 10 factors for a crash were things that are closely related to sleep deprivation. So things like prescription drug use, fatigue, work pressure, inattention, etc. So given that sleep is a really big issue for commercial drivers, obviously the government has tried to regulate it in the past. In 2013, the FMCSA, set the current set of rules that govern how much truck drivers can drive. For every 14-hour session of work that someone does, they're only allowed to drive 10 hours there. There is a minimum 34-hour break between work weeks for drivers, and drivers have to log their hours spent driving on electronic logging devices. So, these are things that literally plug into the car, and as soon as you turn on the engine and start driving, it'll start counting the amount of hours that you've spent. So this seems pretty reasonable. And the FMCSA introduced these regulations basically to try to save lives. But as you saw right here, opinion has been mixed. So the reason why opinion has been mixed is because many drivers have felt that these regulations actually limit individual autonomy for drivers. So for instance, maybe I'm a driver, I am already 10 hours into my trip and I can get home in 2 more hours, but the regulations say that I can't do that. So I have, to pull out and go to a stop for the night, even though I want to, do the extra distance. Or more importantly, let's say that I'm trying to drive with some type of deadline for the goods that I'm carrying, and I encounter unexpected traffic, or maybe there's some type of engine breakdown. I still have to meet the deadlines that I have, but how am I able to do this without like speeding or otherwise taking some type of somewhat dangerous behavior? Historically, what I would do is I would just circumvent the regulations just by fudging my time books a little bit. But with an electronic logging device that's connected and knows whenever my engine's on and when I'm driving, this isn't possible. So there's actually this fascinating study from 2020 that analyzes what exactly the effect has been of these regulations, these new regulations with the electronic logging devices. And they found that when the time kicked in such that the ELDs and all the regulations were all active, because obviously they were just gradually implemented, the number of rule violations decreased, as you might expect, because nobody wants to get fined, but the amount of unsafe behavior actually increased. So their hypothesis is this term called offense displacement, which is that drivers, that needed to make a deadline but were bound by their ELDs, instead sped, took shortcuts, basically took unsafe behaviors in order to get where they needed to go. And the core question here is they basically found that so obviously these regulations were optimizing for safer driving, but instead they seemed to try doing that by regulating a proxy of safe driving, which is, the logged times of drivers. So how can we distinguish the proxy, which is logged times, with the real thing, which is safer driving? That is a question I'll answer in just a minute. Finally, another past intervention for this issue basically is that we have found really fast ways that can diagnose pretty accurately obstructive sleep apnea. This is one example. It's an 8-question, 1-minute questionnaire. All right, so at this point, we've seen that commercial truck drivers are underslept, that their lack of sleep is closely connected with a nexus of other health factors. And one important one of these is obstructive sleep apnea, which is a causal factor of many of the other comorbidities that we just analyzed. We also saw that OSA is severely underdiagnosed, and that there is this question of distinguishing a proxy for safer driving with the real thing. So my solution for commercial truck driving regulations intends to address all of these. So at its core, my solution is trust and education. Let's start with trust. The trust component basically means actually making the current regulations slightly looser in terms of the amount that someone can drive in one session, really with the intention of trying not to limit driver autonomy. However, with the looser regulations also comes these requirements for driver education about sleep. For instance, every registered driver has to take the stop bank questionnaire. Trucking companies have to cover treatment for OSA, as well as other related conditions. And my solution also involves deploying a team of specialists to truck stops to provide point of care treatment or advice for sleep or health issues. So obviously there are some barriers to implementation here. Maybe someone is identified to be at risk, but they don't want to pursue treatment. And the solution here is the point of care professionals that can help. And also maybe requiring testing will be somewhat difficult. And my solution basically says, let's link it with some type of existing government infrastructure that regulates drivers. So maybe something like connecting it to your CDL. Basically, the core expected impact of this solution is that you want to empower drivers, you want to improve their sleep, and you want to increase public safety and reduce crashes. And both the trust and education components there are really meant to do that. More than anything, though, this solution is trying to avoid the types of signal proxies that we saw earlier, really to get to the root of the problem, which is obstructive sleep apnea and a lack of sleep education, rather than just trying to regulate the amount of time that someone can spend driving. And I believe that removing these adverse incentives will really allow our public safety to improve. Awesome. So here are my references for this presentation. And that is everything. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you learned something new.